Hi, this is Carrie Corbet-Owen from Bodywise Perfect Size, talking to Isabel Foxen Duke in the second part of our interview. For the first part, go to our Hayes videos and find it there. How do people stop going crazy around food?
Ultimately, I think feeling crazy around food is really a product of having a dysfunctional relationship with your body, and struggling with negative body image or poor body image, which again comes sort of in two phases. There's the I don't like my body, which I think a lot of people are familiar with because it doesn't fit in with something ideal that I think that I should be. And that's sort of one issue. But then the other issue, which I already sort of alluded to, which I already discussed in this conversation, is I think that I can change it, right? I think that it's just a simple matter of dieting and working hard enough for me to change it. So, personally, I believe that feeling crazy around food just means you're really not surrendered to this reality that your body is not necessarily in your full control. That has probably been the single most important piece of information that I have received in my personal journey towards recovery around food issues, was sort of really understanding that my body's size and shape is not necessarily up to me. And I think that when people really understand that, the food craziness really goes away, because the craziness just comes from trying to control something you can't control. I mean, that is really where all frustration in life comes from. If you want to think about it from like an Eastern philosophical perspective, that is sort of the name of the game. Like, you are going to become frustrated. You are going to feel crazy, so to speak. You are going to be constantly, running around like a chicken with your head cut off if you are constantly trying to control something that is difficult to control or potentially impossible to control, which I think that food and weight to some extent is, or much more so than the diet industry would have you believe. And so I think that that's really, even my clients who are quote unquote successfully restricting, which is a very, very low percentage of people, right? Like, I think like 3 to 5%, something very, very low like that. Even my clients who are quote unquote successfully restricting basically talk to me and they say to me, I feel like I am hanging on by a thread. Like, at any moment I could just fall into a bag of potato chips and never climb out. Like, it is, I don't really think that there is anyone who doesn't feel that way around food. Like, they are sort of fighting some sort of natural pull when they get into a restrictive pattern. And so I think that, that's sort of, that's where the craziness really comes into play. The craziness comes into play when you feel like you're fighting nature. And most people think that most people think that they should be able to restrict and there's something wrong with them that they can't. What I'm suggesting is that there's nothing wrong with you that you can't. There's nothing wrong with you that you have sort of natural and biological urges towards food. That is actually the way it is supposed to be. And fighting it is actually just leading you towards rebellion, and particularly rebellion under like instances of emotional duress. There's some theories, that, we know that emotional eating and eating in response to feelings is very much heavily correlated with dieting. That's something that was actually mentioned in Health at Every Size. People with restrictive histories tend to turn to food in times of emotional duress, whereas people who don't have restrictive histories actually tend to lose their appetite and not eat when they're stressed out. Really interesting, right? So we know that emotional eating and dieting are correlated. And binge eating certainly is just a straight up reaction to dieting, is just straight up reaction to restriction. But even emotional eating is very heavily correlated with dieting. I personally think, and there's a lot of different theories around this. There's so many different reasons why people try to explain this, but one of them is, essentially when you're dealing with an emotional stressor like anxiety or nervousness or fear or whatever, basically, essentially it weakens your willpower, which is a pretty solid, that makes sense, right? So if you're using willpower to control your food, which most restrictors or women with body image issues are doing, essentially when you are anxious, lonely, dealing with an uncomfortable feeling, your willpower is going to be weakened and you're going to end up just doing what you're naturally inclined and want to do anyway. There's sort of, I think, like various other theories that I've heard, like when you're dealing with fear, anxiety, you're going to turn to, if you have a restrictive history with food or a history of scarcity around food, you're kind of going to go into a hoarding phase. You're sort of going to go into a kind of hoarding mentality around food because it's sort of, in the past, one of the biggest dangers to you has been starvation, and has been food being taken away and your energy source being depleted. So like in times of like fear or anxiety, you're going to kind of go towards food. You learn through dieting to move towards food when threatened, basically, rather than away with it. I mean, there's so many different theories to explain this. And to be honest, they're all theoretical, right? I mean, none of these, we don't exactly know why emotional eaters tend to be dieters and why non-dieters tend to not eat emotionally, but we do know these things go together. And I think that that's really important, because I think a lot of people think, oh, sure, yeah, I used to diet, binge cycle, but now I'm just an emotional eater, as if emotional eating has nothing to do with dieting. The truth is that all emotional eating is correlated with dieting. The restrictors are people, like I've never met an emotional eater who didn't have some sort of restrictive history with food. And that's just the reality of the situation.
Isabel, most people think that emotional eating is bad. You have a slightly different take on that.
First of all, I think emotional eating is pretty morally neutral. I mean, I think on the scope, when you think about coping mechanisms, and everyone has coping mechanisms, everyone engages in coping mechanisms. Coping mechanisms are a very important fact of life, and all coping mechanisms, I think actually all coping mechanisms pretty much are morally neutral. It's just a matter of what consequences do they have. Like shooting heroin is a coping mechanism that has pretty severe consequences versus like taking a bath, which has pretty, negligible consequences. It just calms you down, right? Food is sort of on the spectrum of coping mechanisms, a pretty benign coping mechanism. Like eating some food when you are stressed out is really the least of your problems when you're stressed out, I would say. I don't know why, but most women get into a huge tizzy about it. Like the emotional eating is the problem, rather than the fact that they're like dealing with a stressor or anxious or lonely or bored, or actually dealing with like some actual problem. Most women think that the food is actually the bigger problem than what is causing them the stress to begin with, which is like really interesting to me and really like just sort of like just indicative of how crazy this diet culture is. It's like I could be stressed out or lonely or anxious or nervous because I have a big job interview, or, I'm dealing with grief or loss or, any number of things that might be causing me emotional distress. But the problem is that I'm eating over it. Like, oh my gosh, God forbid. And so and that's just a product of fat phobia, that's just the product of weight discrimination. I mean, it's really, really at the end of the day, like if I'm eating, particularly if I'm eating, like whatever, just like, like if I have like a sandwich when I'm not that hungry because I just like want the comfort of some like bready goodness in my mouth or whatever, like it's really just from like a true physical health perspective, is that really the end of the world on the spectrum of coping mechanisms, like I'm not sure it is. I don't know if we have that much evidence to suggest that that is really that big of a deal. And, I've also, as like a reframe for my clients, suggested, like, what if we actually looked at emotional eating as like a positive thing, in the sense of, well, one of the things I learned from emotional eating is that I'm dealing with feelings. Like it's sort of an alarm bell. I wrote this, post that was probably one of my most famous posts ever, called "Why Emotional Eating is Saving Your Ass." And it was really comes from this idea of, emotional eating is really not that big of a deal, but I could make the argument that's a positive thing because it is like a physical manifestation of, it's like a physical reminder, like, oh, I'm dealing with something. I'm having an emotion. I'm trying to numb something out, like what's going on? Why don't I check in? Why don't I look inside and sort of see what's going on with me? It's like a great reminder to temperature check, and sort of be mindful and check in with yourself. So yeah, so I kind of feel like one of the issues that I take with a lot of even, a lot of the mental health practitioners that I know of, even people who practice health at every size and people who have, kind of, who I agree with a lot, there is a tendency towards villainization of emotional eating in the mental health world that I think actually backfires a lot of the time, and actually ends up making women feel badly about themselves and make them feel more self-conscious around their food choices, when really we should be focusing on doing the opposite.
I'm also curious about what you think about the stress of dieting.
I think that stress in general is like a much bigger problem than a lot of foods that get airtime as being problematic. And again, like I say this sort of with this sort of strange sort of like, I always feel like I have to make a caveat, you know, like I always think like, of course, we know that, you know, foods are impactful on our health. And I think that no one in the health at every size, you know, kind of community is denying that at all. It's just a matter of like, to what end, like, what are the trade-offs here? You know, if, you know, eating perfectly is like running you into the ground, keeping you from having a social life, stressing you out, you know, et cetera, like, are those trade-offs really worth it, even in the name of health? I mean, you might actually be, I think that there's sort of, especially when we mentioned orthorexia earlier, there's sort of the bell curve of orthorexia, or the bell curve of making healthful choices, where orthorexia being sort of on one side of the bell curve, where essentially orthorexia, which is essentially, you know, a disease of being obsessively trying to control your health, actually usually generally results in lesser health outcomes than just like your normal relaxed eater who occasionally will have some pizza and a brownie.
What's your take-home message for everyone?
There's really only one way to solve feeling crazy around food. There's only one way out of the diet binge cycle, and that is through body acceptance, and that is through, you know, acceptance of weight set point theory, health at every size, body positivity, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's really just sort of the crux of my work in a nutshell. So I don't do a ton of private coaching anymore, but I have a free video training series called Stop Fighting Food at stopfightingfood.com, which is basically like 3 quick introductory videos about ending the crazy around food, diet binge cycling, just craziness, for lack of a better word. And that is like a really, really easy way to get started. When you sign up for Stop Fighting Food, the video training series, you also automatically get signed up for weekly coaching emails from me, which are basically just short little blog posts that just sort of say like little thoughts about how to change your relationship with food and how to think about food in a non-diet context. I think, you know, ending dieting is a lot more complicated for a lot of people than just saying, oh, I'm not going to go on Atkins anymore, because so many people just think like dieters. It's very hard to escape diet mentality. Dieting is not just going on Weight Watchers or being on Atkins. Dieting is a state of mind. It's a way of relating to food. It's a belief system around food and weight.
I'm wondering how you think meditation helps.
What I learned from meditation is, well, sort of like 2 things. It's really like mindfulness and presence, right? And being able to sit through the waves of my own mind and the ups and downs of my own experience. I mean, there's just so many different areas of this food and weight conversation where mindfulness and presence and sort of, again, being able to like watch my own ups and downs and accept my own ups and downs for what they are can become helpful. Certainly it is helpful when it comes to, let's say, intuitive eating, for instance, something as like sort of simple as just like, what do I eat? You know, and what do I want to eat, and really getting in touch with my body. I think tuning inwards and really being present for what's happening in my physical body is really helpful to that. And meditation sort of helps grow the muscle of self-awareness and understanding what's happening in my body. But then as far as body acceptance is concerned, and some of sort of these deeper self-acceptance issues, I think meditation or any kind of mindfulness practice can also be really helpful in sort of weathering the storms and the ups and downs of life. Because one of the things that I notice is that our body image is often triggered when we feel out of control, or when we feel insecure or nervous or anxious in other areas of our life that have nothing to do with our weight. Like, oh my gosh, I'm nervous my boyfriend's going to break up with me. All of a sudden, I like believe in my head that I've gained 50 pounds, even though that is not the case. Or, oh my gosh, all of a sudden I'm really, really just like having trouble looking at myself in the mirror today. I can't stand the way my body looks because, you know, what I'm actually dealing with is I'm nervous about a job interview. You know, I think that a lot of ups and downs in life and a lot of our sort of our emotional state at any point in time can manifest as body image issues, can manifest in this sort of it can become a body shame trigger. I think mindfulness can be very, very helpful, and sort of acceptance in general, like radical acceptance, practices of radical acceptance, which is, my mind goes hand in hand with mindfulness and meditation, is really, really helpful in sort of weathering these storms and just sort of letting my thoughts be what they are and like allowing them to pass through me and sort of get to the next day. It helps you slow down enough to realize what you're doing, you know, before you actually engage in the restrictive behavior. You can sort of catch it before it happens because you you're self-aware. You can see what's going on in your head, and you can take a step back and sort of analyze it for what it is and be like, oh, that's a restrictive thought. Is that actually rational behavior? Is that actually in my best interest to go down the dieting rabbit hole? Maybe not.
For interviews with other experts in this field, visit bodywiseperfectsize.com. Thanks for joining us.